So, last culture project, I put in way too much effort and didn't realize until my classmates gave their presentations, which were just so much simpler. So, you know, I think I've learned a valuable lesson. I shouldn't put in an unreasonable amount of effort. I'm gonna put way too much effort in again, aren't I? Unlike the other great power in the Mediterranean at the time, the Roman Republic, Carthage doesn't get talked about that much on its own terms. Tons of people learn about Rome, the specifics of great battles, the creation of aqueducts and roads stretching across the empire, the stories they stole from the Etruscans, who stole them from the Greeks, who stole them from the Mycenaeans. We don't often stop to think of the other cultures that impacted it. Except for the Etruscans, who were impacted by the Greeks, who were impacted by the Mycenaeans, of course. The Mediterranean was a huge place, with empires coming and going constantly over its history. Calm seas, an ideal climate, perfect for civilization to grow up in, led to the rise and fall of so many cultures it would probably take hours even just list them all. These cultures had contact for centuries. They would fight wars against each other, then their descendants would fight wars as allies. Cultures would be impacted by each other, only to evolve and be impacted by each other again. And in this area of great cultural interchange developed a civilization. So great and so powerful, it soon became one of the most powerful empires in the Mediterranean. The Phoenicians.
Who?
Oh yeah, let's talk about the Phoenicians real quick. Most people tend to know two things about the Phoenicians, if they remember them at all from their 6th grade history class, that is. Purple and letters, I guess? However, the Phoenicians were much, much more than their sound shapes and expensive snail juice. Take a look at this alphabet. I know we're still on sound shapes, but it's going somewhere, I promise. It has a lot of familiar shapes, and that's because the Phoenicians were basically the Sesame Street of the ancient world. A bunch of different cultures in the Mediterranean borrowed a bunch of Phoenician letters. From east to west and north to south, across the entirety of Europe, you can find their descendants hanging out in a bunch of other people's alphabets. This kind of influence only goes to show how massively influential the Phoenicians were in their own time. And this influence didn't come from battle or conquest, it came from trade. The Phoenicians were the greatest traders of their time. Their ships were constantly going to and fro across the Mediterranean, selling to anyone who would buy. And to get products easily, they set up a lot of colonies. However, as the Greeks and Etruscans challenged their monopoly on trade, and their national sovereignty was threatened by a bunch of empires from the east, many of these colonies became harder to govern, and so they gradually became independent. But none of them were as successful as the city of Carthage. So Carthage is basically just Phoenicia too. After gaining its independence, which probably happened around the 6th century BCE, Carthage went on to do its own thing, which, having been colonized by the Phoenicians for a few centuries, was basically the same thing the Phoenicians did, a lot of trading. Carthage was still occasionally sending tribute to Tyre, the largest Phoenician city-state, despite being politically independent. The other Phoenician colonies in North Africa also kind of went along with what the Carthaginians were doing, giving rise to a distinct Punic identity and creating a new major sphere of influence for Carthage. And so, as the Phoenicians continued to decline, so rose their successors, the Republic of Carthage. Except they're not a republic yet. They're an elective monarchy. The Senate elects a king, and it's a whole thing. It's a whole thing. Anyways, Around 650 BCE, Carthage did its first recorded independent action, the colonization of Ibiza, and by the end of the 7th century BCE, they would become a major center of trade in the western Mediterranean. Carthage set up a lot of colonies and repopulated a lot of old Phoenician ones. Also, because they were bros with the rest of the Punic cities, they would help them out a lot. Also, maybe a little teensy little bit of conquest took place. While the other African former Phoenician colonies were mostly chill with Carthage and went along with their foreign policy, sent tribute, etc., the other ones up here tended more to resist them. Also, it's important to mention Carthage wasn't a bad boy like Rome. Like the Phoenicians, they didn't get most of their influence from conquest or stuff like that, but from trading a lot. And from there, they would push inward into Africa. However, this inward expansion wasn't that major. The reason they needed more space inland was mostly for agriculture to support their cities, but not much more, though they did have to fight a bunch of Libyan tribes for that small bit of inland territory, and eventually had to negotiate. What they mostly focused on during this period was bringing more Phoenician colonies on the east coast of Africa under their influence, but that was made much harder by the Greeks with their colony of Cyrene, those silly little buggers. Westward, the push was much easier, but the Libyans, Numidians, and Mari still fought a few little wars with them, which maybe led to a few rights being violated. Though generally the amount and degree of rights being violated depended on how close you were to the great rights violators themselves, our good friend Carthage. Also, forced military service? Always great to see. Carthaginian citizenship was pretty exclusive, especially because the Carthaginians were more concerned with making that sweet dough than expanding their citizenry. So, to sum it up, Carthage was a lot like the US. America! Imperialistic, but through economic means rather than military ones, and for the most part, more concerned with growing its sphere of influence than actual borders, though the Carthaginians did a lot of that too, more than the modern US. However, so far, we've mostly skipped over this spicy stuff, and I think it's about time we hear about some war, baby. Alright, I don't have a lot of time left, so I'm just gonna go really quick with all the conflicts with the Greeks. So, basically, the Greeks were being all good at trading stuff, and the Carthaginians took that personally. The Greeks coming in and colonizing near them also caused a bunch of Phoenician cities to fall further under Carthaginian influence. There were 3 wars in Sicily, but not strictly in Sicily, called the Sicilian Wars, and one king, Malchus, won campaigns 2 times in a row, but then lost so bad he and his entire army were banished by the Senate, and then he besieged his own city until he was made king again. But then the Greeks saw Persia and were like, damn, wouldn't I like a piece of that? And then finally left the Western Mediterranean open for the Romans. God damn it. So the Carthaginians had a new rival now. But then the Greeks came back under Pyrrhus and were like, on second thought, the Western Mediterranean sounds good. And then they fought Rome and Carthage and defeated Carthage until they didn't, because they treated the colonies they captured really badly, and the colonies rose up, forcing them to leave. And then things returned to normal for Carthage, but grew considerably better for Rome. And that's where the term Pyrrhic victory comes from. And it also set the stage for the next thing we're going to talk about, the Punic Wars. So after the Pyrrhic War, the emboldened Romans took a look at Sicily and were like, well, if the Greeks could do it. The difference between the Greeks and the Romans, however, was the Greeks had a navy that was, existent. And while the Romans had a very well organized, large, eager army, their navy was, let's just say, lacking. And since the war was mostly naval, the Romans were losing. Until they weren't. You see, the Romans did what they did best and just stole ideas from other countries, this time the country being Carthage. And after 23 years of war, Carthage finally lost Sicily with the Treaty of Lutatius, and so came an end to the First Punic War. But at least the war is over, and Carthage can mostly return to no. The mercenaries, who consisted most of Carthage's army, felt they weren't paid enough, so they turned around and attacked Carthage, and then that emboldened a bunch of places Carthage oppressed to not be oppressed anymore, and they fought alongside the mercenaries in a whole new independence movement, which then led to the rebels taking over Sardinia and ruthlessly killing a ton of people. And the Romans saw this as a great opportunity to break their recent treaty with Carthage, which Sardinia belonged to Carthage in, by saying that taking back Sardinia was somehow an act of war, and demanded the weakened Carthaginians give them Sardinia, Corsica, and a buttload of cash in order to prevent war. Pretty much everyone thought this was what you call a... Even Polybius, the Greek historian, who famously tried to be unbiased, and especially the Carthaginians. But if you think they did anything about it, you're wrong. An already weakened Carthage could absolutely not take another war. However, Carthage, realizing it needed to build back up its might for the next inevitable conflict with Rome, took the lands to its north in Iberia, where they gained ready access to silver, agricultural resources, manpower, and most importantly, a band-aid for their lost confidence by looking impressive on a map. So, Carthage now felt confident in its ability to stand up to Rome the next time things got hot. And oh god, did they. So now we're going to talk about the Second Punic War, which I wrote about in my first ever Latin culture project, a 7-page essay, which, by the way, wasn't even done yet at the point I had to turn it in, meaning there were yet more pages to come. Some things never change. So, the Carthaginians found the most OP character on the map. Hannibal Barca was an absolute monster of a general. And oh boy, was Carthage gonna use him. So, Hannibal successfully sieged Saguntum, one of Rome's allies, and Rome did nothing. Until they didn't. Rome declared war in spring 218 BCE, and then immediately Hannibal was like, well, time to cross the Alps, the famously very cold and very hard to survive mountain range, with an entire army, and goddamn war elephants. And he absolutely destroyed the Romans. However, since Hannibal and his army were separated from Carthage, they couldn't get ready access to supplies and had to subsist off the land of whatever random place they were in Italy at any given point. So, even at the point in the conflict, even Roman historians thought Hannibal could have taken Rome. He instead tried to turn Roman allies to the side of Carthage and get the Romans to sue for peace, as he didn't have any siege weaponry or enough manpower to hold Rome even if he could take it. And even though Hannibal was one of the greatest generals in history, one general can't win a war. And with the defeat of Carthage on other fronts, and the defeat of Hannibal in Zama, his only loss in the entire Second Punic War, the Carthaginians were forced to sue for peace after 17 long years of brutal fighting, and their territory was brought from this to this. Their war elephants were confiscated, and their fleet was restricted to 10 warships. And they were forbidden from fighting any wars outside of Africa, and were only allowed to wage war in Africa with Rome's express permission. Carthage had been defeated, and badly. So as if that wasn't bad enough for Carthage, the Numidians came up to Carthage and were like, that's some good land you got there. It would be a shame if someone, took it and then just started invading the place. Carthage continuously asked Rome for permission to fight back, because, in the Treaty of Lutatius, they had to get Rome's permission to fight any war in Africa. But the only response they got was just, lol, no. So eventually it grew to be too much for Carthage, and they fought back against the Numidians, breaking the treaty and causing Rome to threaten war if Carthage didn't hand over all its armaments, which Carthage actually did. And then Rome said, "Cool. Now burn the entire city." So the Carthaginians ghosted Rome and started remaking their armory. Rome arrived at Carthage, ready for a siege. However, the Carthaginians met them with fierce resistance and fought 2 naval battles against them, which they lost, but Carthage still managed to hold out. Until, after 2 years, Carthage finally fell to the Romans in spring 164 BCE, and was immediately met with an aggressive assimilation campaign, leaving Carthaginian identity to become nothing more than that of a Roman port city in only about a century. Over the centuries, Carthage would pass through the hands of several different empires, losing relevancy until it became nothing but an agrarian village. In 1956, Tunisia gained its independence from the French Empire, and Carthage would rapidly grow into what it is today, an affluent suburb of Tunis, the modern capital of Tunisia. Carthage has an interesting legacy. Many people today still fanboy over Hannibal, and the Punic Wars are regarded as one of the most significant conflicts in history. However, Carthage's legacy isn't really its own. When people talk about Carthage and its influence today, it's mostly to look at its impact on Rome and Greece. However, I believe it's important to look at Carthage as its own country, with its own goals, culture, and history separate from the Romans and Greeks. Because if we can look at history through the perspectives of the cultures who didn't make it to develop into our own, the more we can observe the world outside of our ethnocentric lens, the more we can see the world as a place filled with different peoples, living lives just as fully as ours, with their own goals, cultures, and histories. And this way, by moving away from ethnocentrism, we may be able to finally escape the enforcing of our own culture upon others, and move forward, recognizing that our culture and its forefathers are only a select few, not superior or somehow unique, but just a pluribus unum.